Well, good morning. It's good to be with you. It's great to be able to share worship with you, and I thank you, as ever, for your welcome. It's good to see old and familiar faces as well as some new faces, so great. Some of you know I work in the world of IT, or information technology, and I've had an interesting week this week. We've been looking at some new telephone systems. And one of the joys of information technology is we get to look at lots of newfangled whizzo things. And this week's been no exception. I've been seeing how telephone systems have moved on since I last looked at new telephone systems, and it's been exciting to see the potential of some of what the new system that I've yet to sign the order, but we're nearly there with the new order. And it's interesting too how the new systems are starting to integrate with other things. We're not just talking vocally over the phone, we're chatting with each other via Microsoft Teams and Skype and WhatsApp and all these other wonderful tools that we have these days. And in my office, yes, all hell breaks loose if the internet is down or the Wi-Fi's not working and they're banging on my door. Interesting that perhaps we're able to communicate more than ever in our generation. But it's probably also true to say that we say less than any civilization in history. And yet, in contrast, we can talk to God just like that. We just speak to him. We don't need a mobile signal. We don't have to check the Wi-Fi's on. We don't have to check that the battery's charged. We can just speak, and he's there ready to hear us. In fact, we don't need to speak. We can just think. And it's amazing, isn't it? We take it for granted, but it's amazing that we have that access to God. And we call that prayer. And we thought it was great that you showed the little video clip. It gave us a feel of what prayer is. And at the heart of our relationship with God, as with any relationship, it's important that we talk. And I think the Christian life is, it's primarily about relationship. It's primarily about knowing God. And our relationship with God will grow or wither in proportion, I think, to the amount that we talk and listen to him. In fact, the Christian life often starts with a prayer, doesn't it? We pray that, we acknowledge that we've messed up and we say sorry and we ask God to forgive us and be part of our lives. But it doesn't stop there. We're meant to continue the conversation. We're meant to keep in touch with God day by day. As I say, it's so simple. And yet, in a sense too, prayer is hard. I find it hard. You may find it hard for lots of reasons. It's interesting, I came across one book that is quite a weighty tome about prayer, but it's interesting that it opens chapter 1 with this quote, and I could relate to this. We today yearn for prayer and hide from prayer. We're attracted to it and repelled by it. We believe prayer is something we should do, even something we want to do. But it seems as if a chasm stands between us and actually praying. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. I know I have at times, not always, thankfully, but there are times when I find prayer tough and I struggle with it. And so this morning, I'm just going to share a few thoughts with you about connecting with God through prayer. And I'll be perfectly selfish here. The main reason I'm sharing this is because I feel God's been talking to me a lot about prayer. This last 6 months, it seems wherever I turn, whatever I do, even when I turned up to Spring Harvest this year, the theme was prayer. So I think God's trying to tell me something. And despite being a Christian for several decades, I think I've still got a lot to learn about prayer. So let me just share something of my journey, and hopefully from that then I hope that you'll be inspired and encouraged in your own prayer life. So I've picked 5 things that I think I found particularly helpful, and the first of those is the need to be intentional with our prayers. If we're serious about our faith, if we're serious about getting to know God, then we have to set aside time and priority to talk to him. Easy to say, I know. My experience, harder to do. But let's look at the example of Jesus. Several times in the Bible, we read of him going off to pray. Now, if you look at the context of some of those things, Jesus was a pretty busy chap. You'd see him healing lots and lots of people. He'd have the crowds bustling to hear his preaching. The number of people he interacted with on a day was phenomenal at times. I'd be pretty shattered after the end of a day like that, but Jesus always made sure he found time to pray. Luke tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. Mark says very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Now, a while back, Meryl, that's my wife, Meryl, we decided that we'd try praying in the morning, not very early, but we thought we'd try a time of prayer at breakfast. And the problem is that I'm not a morning person, so the very thought of being very early doesn't appeal to me. So we gave this a go. The problem was I sit there at the breakfast table, I'm half asleep, waiting for the caffeine to sort of kick into my bloodstream while I'm munching on the cornflakes. So this idea of Jesus' example of getting up in the morning is a struggle for me. And it has to be said that my wife probably does more of the verbal output at that prayer time than I do. I'm there, sort of, and we persist with it. And it's of some value, isn't it? But in our reading today, I guess some of us are morning people, aren't we? And some of us are brighter in the evenings. And we're all different personalities. So we need to find a time and a place that works for ourselves. In our reading that was read a moment ago, we read in Matthew 6 that Jesus encouraged his followers to go into your room, to close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. So I wonder, where is your lonely place? Where is your room? Where do you go to pray? Is there anywhere that you go to pray? Maybe it's different places at different times. But do you take that intentional time out to go somewhere and pray? One of my friends I was talking to recently was telling me how she likes to pray in the garden. That's a nice quiet place where she feels relaxed and she can pray. My minister, he likes to go into the church to pray. Again, because often in the week he can find a few quiet and peaceful moments. I remember a sermon I heard 30-odd years ago that encouraged you to pray in the toilet. Now, I thought that was a bit, I thought it was a bit radical, not very reverend, was it? Praying to, surely God doesn't want to hear you while you're sitting on the loo. But years later, when I had young toddlers, I realised the wisdom of that advice. Because the toilet was often the only place you could get some peace and quiet. You could go in there, lock the door, and go, Lord, keep me sane. It's mad out there. So the toilet can be a good place to pray. I was talking to another friend recently. She's got a lively 10-year-old. She tells me that the bathroom, when she goes to the bath, that's her place. Fortunately, she didn't tell me too many details. But the bathroom is the place where she prays because she can get away from the hustle and bustle of life and grab a few precious minutes with the Lord. Incidentally, the toilet sermon was preached on a weekend away with this church. So if anyone can remember, David, you might remember that one. You think about it, you can talk to me about it afterwards. But the point of the sermon, isn't it, is about, the point of the toilet sermon, that is the fact that there are often opportunities in the day when we can talk and pray to God. I find today, car's a good place. Don't shut your eyes, by the way, if you're driving in the car, but it's a good place to pray while you're sitting at the lights or you're trundling into the office, or perhaps a walk around the park or whilst you're mowing your lawn. There's loads of points in the day where you're waiting for stuff to happen and you can just maybe grab a few moments with God. But the point is this, that we need to be intentional about it. It doesn't just happen. It's something we have to go out of our way to do. So that's my first point. And my second point is this. I found that It's good to be open and honest when you're talking to God. Sometimes I'm a bit blunt with God. Maybe that's my old age, I don't know. I've even been known to have an old rant with him at times, although I wouldn't encourage you to do that all the time. But let's face it, when we come to pray, God knows how we feel. He knows what we're thinking. So what's the point of pretending with him? Because he already knows, like in that reading again, he knows what we need before we even ask him. He knows what's going on in our lives before we even come to him. Now, you might not want to tell whoever you're sitting next to what's going on in your life, but God already knows, so let's not pretend when we come to pray. Back in our reading, Matthew chapter 6 again, Jesus also says that we shouldn't babble like the pagans, for they think they can be heard by their many words, or as another translation puts it, do not use vain repetitions. I like the Message translation. Find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can manage. It hinted at it in the video, didn't it? That we don't need to come before God with fancy words or posh phrases or certain formulas. We don't have to pray in a special voice. We just come confidently to him like a child comes to their parents. To be honest, to be open, to be sincere. Always like Jesus' parable of the two people praying in the temple. Remember, there was a tax collector and there was the Pharisee. And it's interestingly that it's the simple, honest prayer of the tax collector that he commends, not the waffly, jargon-laden babbling of the Pharisee. The tax collector just says, God, save me, I'm a sinner. Very simple, very down to earth. And I think too, in any relationship, whether that's with God or with those around us, if we're open and honest, it's easier to get things sorted, isn't it? It's easier to deal with things. It's easier to sort things out and move on. It's no good sweeping stuff under the carpet and pretending it's not there. And I think similarly with God, we come before him in simple, open, honest prayers. They're the ones that often connect us closer to God. Because God accepts us the way we are. We can't pretend with him. And we should come into his presence with that in mind. Right, this next bit's a bit more tricky. I want to talk to just for a few minutes about an answered prayer. And I've talked about being open and honest. And let's be honest, not all our prayers feel like they get answered all of the time. Well, mine don't. Sometimes we get a firm no from God. It's kind of like, no, that's not going to happen. And when I look back at my own prayer life, I'm glad God says no sometimes. My life would be, well, I dread to think where it would be if he'd said yes to everything that I'd prayed about. So I'm glad that sometimes he turns a deaf ear. But you know, when you're suffering, or you see people suffering, or you see the effects of war and exploitation in our world, or you see people suffering from debt or addiction or battling with ill health, and we pray earnestly about these things, why is it that God seems inconsistent in his response? You know, since my dad had his stroke, I've seen many answers to prayer for Dad, but he still hasn't answered my prayer for Dad to get his speech back. And that bothers me. And yet I see, sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional, but I've prayed that prayer several times, I'm sure you have. And it seems unfair. I've got a colleague of Merrill's. He's a walking miracle. He's at the other end of the spectrum. He's got several types of cancer. The doctors told him he should have been dead years ago, but he continues to defy whatever when we pray for him. And as I say, he's like a walking miracle. But as Darryl helpfully pointed out the other week, a couple of weeks ago it was when I was here, we have to be realistic about the fact as Christians that we're not immune from trials, are we? We're not immune from suffering. God doesn't say, oh, if you sign up to follow me, you're going to be, nothing bad's going to happen to you. You're going to be let off suffering. We're not exempt from cancer and we're not exempt from illness. And I believe God can heal those things. But the reality is that's often the exception and not the norm. I guess if he always healed, then we'd all end up being immortal and we'd all be on this earth forever. Well, that's clearly contrary to the law of nature, isn't it? At some point, we're all going to die. That's the reality of human experience. Now, when I was thinking about this, I came across the story, or not the story, the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Because, you know, God said no to this prayer of Jesus. And I was encouraged by that, because Jesus experienced this as well. You know, remember how he asked God to take the cup from him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew the next day he was going to die. He wanted a way out. He didn't want to go through with it, really. It's a very open and honest prayer. He was in anguish. He prayed earnestly. There was sweat like drops of blood as he pleaded with the Father. But that cup wasn't taken away, was it? The answer from God was a firm no. And I'm glad of that, because that meant Jesus went through with his death, because that's the means by which we are saved and the means by which we can have a relationship with God. Jesus died in our place, and because of his death, we can be forgiven and we can reconnect with God. I don't know if any of you come across this book. If unanswered prayer is something that you're struggling with, I would commend it to you. It's all about feeling like God's not answering your prayers. But Pete's written a more recent book, and in it I came across this quote. It's perhaps a little bit small on the screen, but I'll read it to you. And I thought, yeah, I feel a bit like this sometimes. I can relate to what Pete is saying here. He says, I definitely don't understand why he does some miracles and not others. It often seems arbitrary. But I'm learning to understand that I may never fully understand, and I'm learning to be a bit more okay with not being okay. Life sometimes hurts like hell, but I've discovered that deleting God from the equation doesn't actually help. It merely removes all meaning and morality from the mess and all real hope for the future. And so I'm sort of stuck with God, even if I don't understand him. But it turns out he's all I've got. Now, if we don't pray at all, we'll never see any miracles. If we do pray, we might see some, and that's great. And I've seen some miracles. But we'll probably never fully understand the logic behind all of those. And I guess if none of our prayers ever made a difference to what happens in the world, if we want to have a relationship with God, we should still pray. We should still hang in there and have the conversation. It's part of the relationship that we have with him. So I didn't press the button so you saw the end of the quote. I'll leave that on for a minute. Can't do two things at once. I'm a man, you see, so that's the problem. Okay. Connecting with God, the fourth thing. So if that was a bit more downbeat, but the reality is that sometimes we wrestle with prayer like that, don't we? And wonder what is going off. And this is why I think this next point is so important, is that prayer should also be two-way. It's sometimes I think we're so busy doing all the talking, pouring out our problems to God, that he becomes like old shoes. Yes, I said old shoes. Just checking you were listening. Old shoes. It's getting a fair way through the sermon, so I just need to make sure you're still awake. Clement of Alexandria, he was one of the early church fathers. He says that we're often like old shoes. We're all worn out except for the tongue. Yeah, bet you know a few people perhaps like that. We like the sound of our own voice, don't we? We like to talk sometimes. And even in prayer, we like to talk. But there is another side of prayer, that of listening. God might actually be wanting to try and tell us something sometimes, but we don't take the time or the energy to listen. And too often, I think, we don't hear him because we're too busy doing all the talking. Just going to skip to this quote because I like this quote. Chrissy and Gerard Kelly, they've written quite a bit about prayer, and they concluded this. They said listening is the rocket fuel of prayer. You can pray without listening, but the weight is enormous. You'll be pushing a vehicle designed to be driven. Once you hear the voice on the other end of the line, though, motivation comes. Energy is sparked. The whole nature of the activity changes. Listening ignites prayer. It is in hearing God that the adventure of prayer takes off. I think we could all probably at times put a bit more energy into the listening as well as the talking. Certainly something I've experienced. So I've lost my place in the notes. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it's right that we come before God with our list of petitions. You know, Jesus has encouraged us in another part of the Bible to ask and we will receive. Tell God what you need. But remember, that's just one aspect of prayer. And I sometimes feel that when I pray that's all my prayer is, a list of asks. And I don't take the time out to listen. Jesus encouraged us to listen, doesn't he? He says, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. It's important to tune in to God. I'll be honest, I struggle with this because I'm not a great listener. Just ask my wife. Maybe we men generally are not good at listening. I don't know. But, you know, I get told off because I don't listen. What chance does God have of me listening to him sometimes? But in a similar way, I guess, to the way I realise that actually I do need to listen to my wife sometimes. I also realise that I need to take the time to listen to God. Let me just give you a few tips, as it were, from my experience. One or two things that I've found help me to listen, just practical things. The first thing is I started to do some journaling. It helps me focus, so that's writing down some of the thoughts and prayers and ideas that are spinning in my head. Because it helps me focus. One of the reasons I don't listen very well is because I'm too busy thinking about something else or I'm distracted by something else going off. So by focusing and writing, I'm less likely to be distracted and I'm more likely then to listen. But journaling's great as well because it means I can look back at some of those things that I've written down. I can see God answering some of those prayers. I can be encouraged by that. And sometimes I see little patterns, perhaps a thread of thought that's gone on for a few weeks or months, where perhaps God's trying to tell me something that I might not have noticed otherwise. Listening to God also involves reading the Bible. The Bible is the primary way that God speaks to us, isn't it? And if we're serious about listening to God, then it's important that we read the Bible regularly. But we can read the Bible in different ways. Often we come to it and we study it and we try to unpick it and understand what God's trying to say. But more recently, I've found that I've taken a slightly different approach to reading the Bible before I pray. I just reflect on it. I don't try and understand all the theology underneath it. I just sort of chew it over in my mind. Let God let his words seep into my thought patterns. And then when I come to pray, I often find I'm in a slightly different frame of mind. I'm at a different point of connecting with God because I've spent time soaking up and meditating on his word. So I end up being more responsive to God rather than just sitting there blurting out what's on my mind. And the other thing I've found helpful is just to spend a few moments at the end of the day or partway through the day just reflecting on stuff with God. Just stopping. That's always the hard bit, doing the stopping bit. But once you get the stopping sussed, you can stop amongst the hubbub of life, consider what's going on around within me, and just invite God to be part of my thinking and the events that are going on around me. As I say, I don't find this aspect of prayer easy. I'm by no means expert, although I'm standing up here and you might be sitting there, of course, Simon, he has a wonderful prayer life. Believe me, I don't. I struggle with it. But I find these things help. And if we persist in them, then I find that God, sometimes I hear him a bit more clearly than when I'm just bustling and hustling through life. So perhaps we can all do a bit more listening. My final point is this: we just need to do it. Just do it. It's not an advert, by the way, the just do it bit. But, you know, on my journey of prayer, I found sometimes you read the books, you listen to the sermons, you listen to the podcasts, you're doing all the interesting stuff, and then you spend a couple of hours reading a book or whatever, and you think, I haven't actually prayed. You know, we miss the main event if we're not careful. And or we think that, you know, prayer's this vast subject that we're never going to fully understand, and perhaps we don't feel very good at it, and my few mumbling words are not very perfect before God. It doesn't matter. Someone once said, you do what you can, not what you can't. God's not expecting us to be perfect. He just wants to come before him and be real with him and connect with him and talk with him and listen to him. We just need to do it, however imperfect it is. See, we worry sometimes about prayer, getting it right, getting the right phrases. As I say, we just need to be open and honest with God and make sure that we do it. I love this little snippet that I found. Rowan Williams, I think, said it on BBC Radio at some point. But he likened prayer to sunbathing. But you never thought of prayer in the context of sunbathing before? Certainly not much sunbathing going off at the moment, is there? But anyway, Rowan Williams, he said this about prayer. He said, there is something about sunbathing that tells us more about prayer, what prayer is like, than any amount of religious jargon. You're not going to get a better tan by screwing up your eyes and concentrating. You simply have to be there where the light can get at you. And if you want to connect to God, you've simply got to turn up and be there and let him connect with you. God longs to connect with us, but sometimes we're a bit lackluster in our enthusiasm to connect with him. So I'd encourage you to just turn up, whatever. Don't worry about all the right formula and formats, but turn up and make that effort to be intentional, to be open and honest. Accept the reality that sometimes prayer is hard and you don't always understand the answers. And make sure you include some time to listen to him. Well, I started off talking about tech, didn't I? Well, when in my job, working with tech, I'm often asked to give my staff tips on how they can make better use of software and the like. So I've got a tip for you this morning. May interest some of you can turn off at this point. But for those of you who like to get absorbed in your mobile phones, check out this application. You can get it on the App Store or on Android. It's from an organisation called 24/7 Prayer. And they have an app called The Inner Room. And it's a place where you can log your prayers, you can be prompted to pray during the day. And I don't know if you're like me, you're forever sort of looking at your phone, see what the football... I'll be doing it this afternoon when the Arsenal match is on, see what the score is. But now when I look at my phone, I get distracted by some positive things. A few prayer prompts, or a few people, oh yeah, Fred's doing that today, I need to pray for him. So, not for everyone, but I just encourage you, if you're a bit addicted to your mobile, to explore that. Anyway, I'm going to shut up. I think I've said more than enough and waffled on more than enough for one morning. Thank you for staying with me and listening. I just hope that in sharing some of my journey of prayer over this last 6 months or so in my own life, that I'd encourage you in your prayer life. Prayer's a fantastic thing if you can get to grips with it. God's an amazing being, isn't he? If we can just connect that little bit closer to him, then it fuels our lives in amazing ways. And whilst we won't always understand it, it's an amazing experience and journey to go through. And I commend it to you wherever you are in your prayer life.